Hi, everyone. We're delighted to welcome you here today to the Engaged Research Seminar Series brought to you by UCD Research. Today, we focus on community resilience, and we're delighted to welcome Professor of Urban Planning at Texas A&M University and author of the 2020 book called Engaged Research for Community Resilience to Climate Change, by Dr. Shannon Van Zandt. Dr. Shannon Van Zandt is director of the Texas A&M University Center for Housing and Urban Development and senior fellow of the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. In addition to the aforementioned book, she authored the 2014 book, Planning for Community Resilience, a handbook for reducing vulnerability to disasters, along with more than 70 other journal articles, book chapters, and technical reports. Shannon serves as president of the board of Texas Housers, one of the nation's premier advocacy organizations for low-income housing, and has been an active advocate for housing recovery after hurricanes like Ike, Dolly, and Harvey. We're delighted she can join us today to share her insights and experience with engaged research and community resilience. We'll be hosting some questions after Shannon's presentation. So if you'd like to add in questions as we go along, there's a facility in the chat that you can ask the questions as we go along, and we'll take them up at the end. We're also going to record this session today for the benefit of some colleagues that cannot attend. So over to you, Shannon. And thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Liam, for having me, and thank you to Emma as well for the invitation to be here. It's morning here in Texas. I understand it's afternoon there in Dublin, so I'm glad to be here, and I hope you all have had a good day. I still have a long day ahead of me, but hopefully you're coming to the end of yours. But again, or maybe you have a little more time. I am happy to be here this morning to share with you some of my engaged research related to community resilience. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. All right. Hopefully you see that now.
Yep, looks good.
Very good, very good. All right, so again, the title of my presentation is Engaged Research for Community Resilience. And what I would like to do is, let's see if I can get it to move forward, that would be helpful. Let's see. I'm not seeing my original screen, which, here we go. Now I can advance. Thank you. All right. So I want to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I want to get you situated with what kind of work I do and how it's related to community resilience. Talk a little bit about why I do engaged research and how I do engaged research. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of projects. One is a little bit of an older project, but it has had a big impact on my career and it continues to be relevant today. And I'll also talk about a current project, the East Aldine Mandatory Buyout Project. And then I'll share a little bit more with you about kind of the obstacles and challenges that I face doing engaged research. And hopefully that will start a conversation. I'm going to try to leave a little time at the end for questions. I also have a map up here to get you all situated. I have to keep in mind when I'm speaking to an international audience that you may be less familiar with the geography of the United States. And I want to particularly point out the Gulf Coast. I still call it the Gulf of Mexico, as I believe the rest of the world does as well. But the Gulf is, of course, a major source of hurricanes and other kinds of climate-related events. I want to point out, as best I can, Texas here, and particularly the coast of Texas, as it relates to the rest of the Gulf Coast. This map shows a mix of both frequency of hazardous events, as well as its interaction with different income levels. So I think it does a nice job of showing, where are the most vulnerable areas to climate change, as well as the disasters associated with climate change across the United States. And it's clear from the map that the South, the Old South, the South as we understand it in the United States, is very much affected not only by hurricanes, but also by poverty. And in particular, I want to point out the Houston area, which you can see, and I'll have another map of it later, a little bit of this inlet, which is Galveston Bay. So a lot of my work is focused on the Houston area as well as Galveston Island, and also the southernmost point of the United States, right down here, called which we call the Lower Rio Grande Valley. So the city of Brownsville is the southernmost point of the U.S., and this area is also one of the nation's most impoverished areas. It's typically the counties in that region are within the top 10 counties in terms of poverty rate. And it's also a heavily Hispanic area, not necessarily of undocumented residents, but there are a lot of undocumented residents there, as well as people born in the United States and legal residents as well. So after getting you guys situated, I want to give you kind of an overview of the kind of work that I do. So my work really sits at the intersection of affordable housing and disaster impacts. I'm trained as what we call a houser, so someone who's very interested in affordable housing, particularly for the lowest income members of our society. And that's what I was doing when I came to Texas A&M. But then in 2008, we were struck, Galveston Island was struck by a major hurricane, Hurricane Ike. And that really changed the direction of my career. Texas A&M is home to the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center, which is one of probably 3 social science disaster centers in the U.S. that have been doing this for a really long time and have very strong reputations across the nation. And so I was drawn into the Hazard Center and was able to do a study of Galveston Island, its community recovery after Hurricane Ike, which for many years was a top 3 hurricane in terms of the losses, property losses in particular, until Hurricane Harvey and some of the more recent Maria and now Helene that are very expensive hurricanes that have caused quite a lot of damage. And so I started thinking about, how have the development patterns in the United States led to such great impacts, particularly for low income and minority populations? And so, of course, when we look at the history of the United States, we can't overlook, and I can't stop talking or teaching about, despite efforts to trying to keep us from doing that, talking about segregation and the legacy of segregation in the United States and the impacts that it had on where people are able to live and what their exposure is, not only to disasters, but also a lack of opportunity and other kind of negative impacts based on the restrictions in terms of where they've lived. So I look particularly at how those development patterns have influenced the impacts they receive from a disaster, as well as how they're able to recover from a disaster. And this outline that you see on the slide is kind of my guiding principles in terms of how I think about this. And we first recognize that people and households vary in their capacity to anticipate, cope with, respond to, and recover from disasters. That's the general term for that is social vulnerability. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but recognizing that there are differences in how people can prepare for and respond to disasters. We also know that people and households are not randomly distributed in space. They are concentrated in patterns that are fairly predictable based on some of their household characteristics, particularly income and race ethnicity. Things like concentrated poverty and segregation are still characteristic of the development patterns in the United States, even though segregation is no longer legal. We still continue to see discrimination in our mortgage lending and housing market in terms of who's able to live where. And we know that the patterns that were established during the period of segregation in the United States have proved to be very durable. And so our cities are still segregated, both by race, ethnicity, and by income. Those patterns increase exposure to flooding and other hazards and have both short-term and long-term consequences for socially vulnerable populations. So you see a phrase over on the left-hand side of the screen that says, low-income households live in low-quality homes in low-lying areas. And this is kind of a convenient way for me to remember and also to convey the interactions between where people live, how they live, and their risk to disaster. It's especially related to flooding because we know that water runs downhill, and flooding is a little bit easier to predict in terms of where it will flood than some other disasters like fire or earthquake are. But most of my work focuses on flooding related to hurricanes or to heavy rains. And so it kind of fits, and it helps me convey the message that I'm trying to convey. So when we talk about social vulnerability, this addresses that part of people varying in their capacity to respond to disasters. And we look mainly at characteristics that you see listed across the top: race, ethnicity, education, gender and household composition, income and poverty, housing tenure, whether one owns or rents, age, and disability is one that I fail to put on there, and I always forget to talk about, but it is also very important. And we know that those characteristics lead to differences in how people receive information, the assets and resources that they have to address the needs related to disaster, as well as their power or influence in a community. And so what we have observed through the literature, some work of my own and a lot of work from other people, is that because of these characteristics, we see disparities in pretty much every stage of disaster: warning, damage, preparedness, evacuation, recovery. I think in a couple of slides, I'll talk about that just a little bit more. And you'll also see some pictures. Both of the pictures that you've seen on the last two slides are from the lower Rio Grande Valley and are really relatively low rainfall events. So you can get an idea of what happens during a rainfall event. And here in Texas, when we have rain, it usually comes in a very short period of time with very heavy downpours, and then we have long periods of no rain at all. And so sometimes these rain events can really be difficult to deal with. And we just actually had one a couple of weeks ago that we are still dealing with. And so going back to that low income people live in low quality homes in low lying areas, that is how I think about this relationship between the different characteristics. So hazard exposure refers to those low lying areas, or the risk that people have living in the areas where they live. Are they exposed to flooding? Are they exposed to fire, drought, earthquake, ice storms, all of the things that we experience with some regularity in the United States? And certainly Texas is kind of it's a very high disaster state. We have almost every kind of disaster, and we have them with some frequency. And this year has been no different. We have already had a number of different disasters. We're still recovering from some disasters last year: Hurricane Beryl. We also had a derecho, which was a very severe wind event. We've had tornadoes and floods just in the past few weeks in Texas as well. So there's a lot of hazard exposure. And then we also talk about physical vulnerability, which refers to the kind of the low quality homes aspect, the age, the construction quality, the maintenance level of structures, both homes and other buildings, as well as infrastructure, including roads and telecommunications and power lines, and all of the things that we depend on to keep us safe and allow us to communicate, and all of that sort of thing. And then, of course, the social vulnerability, which I just spoke about, recognizing that people that are not, not your standard white cis man, basically is what I tell my students a lot. The further you are from that, the more vulnerable you are, at least in the United States, because of differences in capacity and power and respect, as well as the basics of income and discrimination related to race, ethnicity. And where those things overlap with each other are the areas that we really want to focus on, especially as an urban planner. There's other disciplines that look at social vulnerability. Notably, we have indices from geography, the social vulnerability index, which is maybe the most widely used, or has been the most widely used, that comes out of geography. And then we have one from the Center for Disease Control, which is coming from a public health perspective. Those understandings have different purposes. But for planners, we like to map all this out. We like to see where the overlaps are so that we can target particular interventions, whether it's evacuation of transportation dependent households, whether it's sheltering needs for elderly or families with children. We can identify areas within our communities, particularly at more of a fine-grained scale, so that we know where those people are populated and where they are that are likely to be affected by whatever disaster we happen to be experiencing. So the literature tells us that low and minority households in particular are particularly vulnerable because their spatial patterns are more pronounced than perhaps some of the others. But they do tend to live in concentrated areas, and across the board, we see that low and minority households are more likely to display lower levels of preparedness, not necessarily because they don't know to prepare, but because they don't have the resources to prepare. We know that low and minority household incomes rely upon different kinds of networks and channels to receive information, particularly related to warnings. And we were just told yesterday that the National Weather Service will no longer offer their warnings in any language other than English, which has not been the case. Up until very recently, we did not have an official language in the United States, but apparently, according to our president, we now have English as our official language. And the National Weather Service will no longer give warnings in any language other than English, which will make things worse. Evacuation, we know that low-income and minority households are less likely to respond to warnings and are less likely to evacuate, or as we saw even in Hurricane Ike from my own research, that they're likely to evacuate later. But the biggest impacts really are related to damage and recovery. Low and minority income households are more likely to be disproportionately impacted and vulnerable to flooding, and they take much longer to recover. They face obstacles in negotiating and qualifying for financial resources, and they are typically not included in the recovery planning process and the decision-making related to recovery after a disaster. So that's what I do. That's my big research agenda. I don't always do engaged research. I also do, standard quantitative and qualitative research with primary and secondary data sources. But over the course of my career, I have had an opportunity to become engaged with the communities in which I'm working, and I've taken advantage of that. And I find that research is very rewarding. And so I want to share a couple of cases with you. So why do I do in community engaged research? And I think the main reasons that I do it are because we can address real problems. That's part of the reason that I became a planner, is that it's a very applied discipline. You know, we borrow from very many other social sciences and physical sciences, but planning is an applied social science. And so the application part of it is very appealing to me, and is what's drawn me into this type of research. We can address real problems. We can have an impact on communities, and I feel that the work that I've done with community partners has had an impact on communities, real communities. And then mainly, I think the most important reason is to lift and amplify the voices of the marginalized. We have a lot of people in Texas and in the United States whose voices are not heard. And it's important to me as a planner and as a human being, and certainly as a scientist and researcher, to use the gifts that I've been given and the privilege that I have in terms of my status, the opportunity to speak to audiences like you all and other audiences across the nation, that folks like those pictured here will never have an opportunity to communicate to. And so that's why I do it. Now, I'm also asked to talk about it a lot in different kinds of audiences, and so I feel that I have to make the argument for it, particularly when I'm working with scientists like engineers and others for whom this is really strange. You know, community engaged research is really strange. It's not part of how they were trained or their discipline, and frankly, it's really not right for everybody. But for some people, it is. And so the argument that I make is that it improves our research. It makes it better, qualitatively better, because the people that we're working for know their communities better than we do. And despite the fact that we have fabulous data resources and we can find out a lot of facts about their communities, we don't really know how they function. Communities are living organisms. They change every moment. They are dynamic, and the people who live there know their communities better than we do, and better than our data can enlighten. Now, sometimes that exchange of data with resident experiences is really powerful because they can tell us what works and what's true and what's not true. And the most embarrassing thing to do is to go into a community and present to them facts about their community that they don't recognize and that they don't believe. I've had that happen with students, and it's not a great feeling. I think community engaged research also helps develop research questions that we might not otherwise look at. Sometimes we go into communities thinking we know what their problems are, and they tell us that that's not what their issues are. Or even if those are issues, and they often are, that they're not the most important issues to the community. The best example I have, and the one that I always think about, is that we went into a neighborhood in Houston, a primarily Hispanic neighborhood. And I use the term Hispanic instead of Latinx or Latino because that's what the people that I work with use. I know other people prefer different terms, but Hispanic is usually the term that is preferred by the communities that I work in Texas. But we went into a community thinking that urban flooding was the issue. It's the issue we wanted to address because it's what we were interested in. But when we got there, they told us that no, yes, that's an issue, but it's not the most important thing. That dumping and water pollution and air pollution were the most issues that they really felt like affected their quality of life a lot more than the urban flooding did. And that was eye-opening for me. That helped me understand, you know, that if we really want to help communities, we need to ask them what the problems are instead of counting on our own knowledge, which comes from, you know, different, much more removed kinds of data sources. We also, and the persuasive thing that I talk to the engineers about a lot is that community residents and stakeholders can both validate and verify data and findings. So we call that ground truthing. And there was a day when after I'd been working on a team, we're just coming to the end of the project, a 10-year project that it was mostly engineers with a social science team that was based here at Texas A&M. And I got the engineer to use the term ground truthing, like without me being there. And I was so happy because I felt like they had actually listened to what I'd said and recognized that actually sharing your data and your preliminary findings with the community made a measurable improvement. It helped you to know what was actually happening on the ground. So that was really super important. And then, of course, if we want people to use our information, we need to include them in the process of developing it. So the programs and the toolkits that we end up developing as planners and policymakers are going to meet the needs of the residents better if the residents were involved, and they're more likely to be used by them. And I think, a lot of us spend time trying to build toolkits and data dashboards and a lot of other public facing types of tools that we want people to use. But if we're not engaging them in the development of those tools, and not just the other scientists or the policymakers from the local community, but the actual residents, if we can make it work for them, then they can advocate for themselves. And ultimately, that is what I want to see happen. I want to make it possible for people to speak for themselves and to show persuasive data to the people that make decisions for them, so that they are empowered to take their own actions. And that's really important. But I also recognize that community engaged research is very time consuming, just like all forms of public participation are. You have to have a lot of meetings, you have to have them at different times of day, you have to make sure that everyone who needs to be there is invited and feels welcome and has the support they need to actually engage with you. And that makes it expensive. And sometimes you're going to get confusing feedback. You're going to get feedback that you didn't expect and you don't really know what to do with. You may have trouble building consensus. You may have people that disagree with one another. And what do you do with that? How do you then go back and incorporate that into your program building or even your data analysis? So for these reasons, I think a lot of people avoid doing community engaged research, just like they avoid doing public participation. Sometimes we don't really want to know what people think. We just want to do what we thought we needed to do, and we don't want to have to worry about responding to their issues. That's unfortunate. I think that results in poorer science and certainly poorer impacts of the work that you're doing. And so I would always argue in favor of taking the time and spending the money to do it right the first time. For those of you who aren't planners, you may not recognize this. If you are planners, you most likely will recognize this, but this is a classic of urban planning literature, and it's something that every planning student, at least in the United States, must learn. And this is what we call Arnstein's ladder of participation. It comes from Sherry Arnstein. It was published in 1969, which was just before I was born. So it's a classic. It's been around for a long time, but what it explains is the different levels of participation. Because I think a lot of what we do, both as planners, but also as public officials, a lot of our public officials really don't want participation, like I just mentioned. So at the bottom of the ladder, you see things like manipulation and therapy, a way of interacting with people that's not really leading to a meaningful input from the community. Then we see a lot of what we might call tokenism, informing, consultation, placation. These are like public presentations or public meetings where you're just giving information in one direction and not receiving it back, or at least not listening to it if you do. But at the top of the ladder are things like partnership, delegated power, and citizen control, ultimately citizen control. And these are what we really strive for. This is what we should be striving for with our engaged research, and really with all community engagement, is that we want our citizens to be civically engaged in their communities and to take responsibility for implementing new ideas and plans to make our quality of life better for all residents, not just for individuals, but moving from individual interests to a community future. And then for that reason, participation really must be inclusive, and that's difficult, getting people to the table that aren't always at the table or don't feel like they belong at the table, persuading them that they do belong at the table and that we value their voices. And that means that we also have to be authentic and transparent in our communication, which I probably am to a fault. A lot of people call me blunt, and I sometimes say things that probably maybe shouldn't be said. I mean, they should be said in the sense that they're true and they're transparent, but they might not, other people might not want me to say them because maybe they could be hurtful, or sometimes, particularly in our current political climate, they're not advisable. But I say them anyway. The interactivity of is really important. The talking, but more importantly, the listening. I think, I don't know if this is true just in the United States or across the globe, but it's certainly true in the United States. We are not good at listening to one another. We talk past each other, we argue, we listen just to respond and not to actually to hear a person. And so that listening skill is really, really important. And we're not modeling it very well for our young people or our students, and we need to do better. And then, of course, accessible. We want people to be able to get to the table and to be able to participate on their own terms and not in a very limited way like we typically do public meetings. Okay, so I'm going to try to move quickly to get through these slides. I always talk too long. So this is a case, this is following Hurricane Dolly that happened in 2008. So just to get you reoriented, we're going back a few years to Hurricane Dolly, which not very many people remember, but it was a major rain event. It dropped about 17 inches of rain across the lower Rio Grande Valley, which you can see up here in the red. I put a little Texas map to remind you of where we were. And because the soil in the lower Rio Grande Valley is clay, the water doesn't drain. And so the water stood for up to 6 weeks in some areas. You know, it was getting lower during that time, but it stayed. And so you can see some of the pictures of what that looked like. Here we see in the lower Rio Grande Valley kind of the interactions between income, density, and flood zone, where some of the urban areas, which are shown here in gray, are the safest areas generally, but this area is also very low income, and then we have a lot of density, particularly a little further in from the coast. But reminding you, and you'll see the word colonias mentioned, this is one of the poorest areas in the United States. And when we talk about colonias, we're talking about these unincorporated communities that are outside of city limits. So if you look at this map here, you can see the urban areas in gray, and then you see all these little pink dots. Some of them are quite large, but a lot of them are very small. And these are the colonias. And there are well over 500,000 people living in colonias along the Texas-Mexico border, and even more as you go towards along the whole border through to California. A lot of people live in these very substandard communities that typically don't have real infrastructure, although they have gotten better over the last 30 years. Many of them still have dirt roads. They don't have infrastructure for flood control or even water treatment. Some of them don't even have water, where they have to bring in water separately and just, you know, on a truck or something like that. They don't have all of they don't have stormwater management. They don't have much of that. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, this is some of the housing from the Colonias, and I've shown you some very extreme examples. Certainly the three that look like they're cobbled together. They are literally cobbled together. They're built by the residents. You can see that they may not have floors. They may not have electricity, or if they do, it's very limited electricity. They may have tarps for roofs. But then you'll also see housing like you see on the lower left, that is, you know, it looks very well built and is well built. Some of these may be built by the residents themselves. Some of them may be built by local organizations, but there's a lot of variation in the quality of housing. So I wanted to give you kind of the full spectrum. So some of the work that we did and that my team did was to really look at post-disaster recovery. At that time, it was like the last 10 years, which was included Katrina in 2005 and basically since then. And we found a lot of patterns related to difficulty making fast decisions, difficulty involving the community after a disaster, using local capacity rather than bringing in people from the outside, a lot of difficulty with people navigating resources and assistance, and really the tension between getting things back to normal and actually trying to build back better, that tension between restoration and resilience. You can see some of the different agencies and partners that we were working with. Some of them, like HUD and the state of Texas, are governmental, and then Texas Appleseed, Texas Housers are both advocacy groups. Lupe is a community organizing group. Rio Grande Legal Aid is a very important resource to help people navigate the legal system. So we put together a pilot program based on a lawsuit that led to a conciliation agreement between the state of Texas and the federal government that brought an additional $3 billion into the state of Texas for rebuilding, not just after Dolly, but after Ike as well. They happened the same year. And so part of that money was put aside for a pilot program to build rapid rehousing. The idea was that we wanted to get families back on their property within 3 months and allow them to kind of continue rebuilding from a core that they were sheltered, but they needed to continue building on. And so we worked with the Community Development Corporation of Brownsville, which is a major home builder in the area for low-income housing, BC Workshop, which is a nonprofit architecture firm, as well as community organizers out of Lupe, and then Texas Housers, which is an advocacy group, and then the Hazard Reduction Recovery Center. That's me, is still me. And we went through this pilot project where we developed this building and delivery method. I'll show you a finished house in a minute. And we worked across different organizations trying to figure out how to make this process better in the future. So my job was really to observe and evaluate the program and then offer a set of recommendations for how we could do this in the future. The building and delivery method was paired with an engaged design and outreach process where we were actually asking people who had been displaced from their homes what they needed in their new house. And particularly for low-income homeowners, they had never had this opportunity before. I mean, most middle income homeowners don't really get a chance to say what they need in their house. They pay for whatever is available in their price range and they live with it, they deal with it. But this was a very kind of affirming process for these new homeowners, and they were just elated with the opportunity to give some input into how their house would be built and how it would be designed. And then we also were engaged in trying to develop a new approach to pre-disaster planning. A lot of what my focus was trying to develop how we could do this better, how we could coordinate between local disaster teams, the state level, and well, this is still local, but then state and federal entities at the top, because there's all these different players in disaster recovery. They get activated at certain times. There are different sources of money that come in that can be used for different purposes. There certainly are concerns related to who's eligible for what, particularly in the lower Rio Grande Valley, where we have a lot of mixed status families. But we were really looking at how planners can be more involved in the disaster recovery process and how they can streamline this process, because basically it gets redesigned with every disaster, and that is very inefficient, it's very slow, and it's very expensive. So our goal has been to develop a new way of doing it, and we're not there yet still. This is taking place over 10 years ago now, but it has continued to inform how we understand disasters and how we are preparing for them. So what we came to is this idea called pre-recovery planning or pre-disaster planning. I believe as a planner that we really must have something in place before a disaster happens, excuse me, in order to be ready when a disaster happens. And we also want to, like, this was a way of institutionalizing temporary to permanent solutions, so that we weren't going from shelters to temporary housing back to permanent housing, but that we were able to move immediately into temporary housing that then became permanent housing. So this is one of the Rapido homes, one of the models that we built, and it has kind of a core bathroom, kitchen, sleeping area that's built first, and then the houses can be built from the inside out, basically, while people are living there. And the idea is that we're mitigating population displacement. We're keeping people in their community, which is really important, particularly for low-income people. They need to be where their social support systems are. They need to get their kids back in school. They need to get back to work, all of this stuff. Okay, I was able to testify to the Texas legislature. It took 3 legislative sessions, but we finally got a bill passed that allowed communities to work with our center here at Texas A&M. And we are currently, we developed a disaster housing recovery planning toolkit, which is on our website. I will send Emma the link so that you can take a look at it. And I'm currently working with the city of Brownsville to write a pre-disaster recovery plan here many years later, but we're still working on it. We're still making progress, and it's been a major project of my career, although I haven't actually really published on it much, which is one of the cautionary tales of doing it as an academic. Okay, I'm going to try and move really quickly through these mandatory buyouts. This is East Aldine. This is an area that is in Harris County, which is where the city of Houston is. You can see kind of the red square. It's unincorporated Harris County, which means it's completely surrounded by the city of Houston, but it's not actually annexed as part of the city of Houston. You can also see from this map that Houston is an incredibly flood-prone area. So you can see the Galveston Bay over here, the actual floodway, and the Houston Ship Channel that runs into the city of Houston. It's kind of an inland port, but it has access to the Gulf. And then all of these bayous that run through the city, and that Houston's also very low lying. And so when it rains, it floods. And this, Houston is kind of a little bit of a ground zero for climate change impacts, because it is prone to sea level rise, it is prone to extreme rain events, and it can also, is affected by hurricanes with surge. So there are many areas of the community that are repeatedly flooded, and some of the housing that is in those areas you see here, these are my own photographs from walking through the neighborhood. They've already been elevated in many cases, and pretty high, probably 8 to 10 feet off the ground. There are also a number of mobile home parks, and it's hard to see in this picture. Ooh, sorry, I clicked on it instead of pointing to it in this picture, but this is actually a mobile home that is elevated about 8 feet off the ground. So it looks kind of ridiculous. But the housing is very vulnerable. It's in very poor condition. A lot of it has been there for generations. Of course, you know, generations in the United States are a little bit different than generations in Europe. We haven't been here that long, but some of these families have lived here for generations and are very tied to the community. Houston and Harris County have created a mandatory buyout program, which is basically forced displacement. They're using eminent domain to condemn these properties and force people out. The communities are very poor and primarily Hispanic, and I don't think that's an accident in terms of those communities being targeted for these programs. What makes this research community engaged instead of just qualitative, because we're doing interviews as our form of data collection, but we're also working with partners who have the trust of the community. We're including resident input in the design of the study and also in the interpretation of results. And we are prioritizing policy impact over publication, which in a very practical way means that we're writing the report that goes back to the community before we're writing any publications. We're actually working on the first report right now. It's a very in-depth report, and it'll be easy to convert it into a publication. But our highest priority is getting it back to the community and getting it into the hands of policymakers so that we can actually influence the program as it continues and make it better. Some of our preliminary findings, and I'm just going to go through these real quickly, mainly is that the county, Harris County, which is administering the program, has not designed it well, and they really haven't staffed it well. Relocation specialists, there's a lot of turnover. They don't understand the program. We're finding that households, it's taking a lot longer to get them relocated than they were told that it would. There's been a lot of unexpected costs related to it when it wasn't supposed to have any impact on the household's expenses or debt. And we're certainly that the households are really struggling with the whole program. They don't want to do it in most cases. They don't have a choice, unfortunately, and it's not been executed well. We've also seen impacts related to their mental and physical health, related to stress, depression, a lot of sleep issues, as well as loss of community, loss of social cohesion, breaking apart communities, really. Additional neighborhood decline, so that once some buyout started, where the rest of the neighborhood was still there, but there was an increase in crime, an increase in dumping, a lot of feelings of injustice. And I wanted to show you, these are actually slides from when we went back to the community to share with them our preliminary findings, which is why they're both in English and in Spanish. We also had interpreters, and our presentation was delivered in both English and Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, so I also listened to the interpreters as the Spanish speakers were presenting. But it was a really neat meeting, and it was very meaningful to the residents to be involved and to be able to kind of check our work and see if what we heard is what they meant for us to hear. So we have made some recommendations in terms of how the program can be done better, how it can be made more simple, how it can be made more equitable and transparent, and ultimately more humane. A lot of our programs just really, they don't consider particularly our most socially vulnerable populations. And it doesn't take too long to read, but we tried to make, this is something we shared with them. We wanted to make it really simple and very clear and have it be in both English and Spanish. So to conclude, because I'm already running later than I would like to be, engaged research has been really rewarding for me. It can be slower. It's certainly less predictable. But ultimately, I have seen, well, really, it's defined my career, I would say. Even though I was not trained to do engaged research, and it really wasn't introduced to me as a graduate student. But I have worked with others who are really good at it, and I've learned a lot from them. It's very important to work with community partners. We only go in where we're invited. We work very hard on maintaining relationships, and particularly maintaining reciprocal relationships. I think probably the most important part of engaged research is giving back your results to the community. A lot of researchers can be very exploitative when they work with communities. And at least until our new presidential administration, a lot of our federal funders were looking for community engaged research, and were beginning to fund community engaged research where they wanted to see partnerships with existing communities. A lot of that research is being cut right now, is losing funding, which is very distressing, and we won't go into that too much, but it's not going to change the way that I work. And if I can't get funded research over the next 4 years, then I have plenty of data and other research that I can write about and talk about, so that I can continue doing this kind of work. I will say it can be hard to publish. I have not published much from the Rapido project. I think we will get some publications out of the East Aldine buyout project, but we haven't yet, because it's our second priority, which, as a tenured faculty member, I can stand to wait. Like, it's not an issue for me. But for junior faculty or faculty that don't have tenure, it can definitely be a problem. So I'm going to stop there so that I can answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Shannon, for your excellent talk on engaged research and community resilience. I think it was very thought-provoking and inspiring at the same time. I think we have a very short time just to ask you a couple of questions, and we have one in the chat. I'm just going to read it out, and it's really asking, could you please provide some information about the land ownership within the communities that you're investigating? Is it different to other places? And are you considering that in the pre-covery process?
That's a great and excellent question. So in the lower Rio Grande Valley, the colonias are primarily located on land that is owned by one large landowner. And basically the people that live there may be workers on that agricultural land or on the ranch. And they typically don't get they can purchase the land, but they don't get the title to it until they've paid it off. So they actually don't own it,
Okay.
but they're allowed to build on it. And we call that contract for deed. It's a very exploitative way of selling land, but it continues to happen across the state in more rural areas. In the buyout area, it's mostly homeowners and landowners that we are working with, but we are working also with some mobile home parks where the land is owned by one owner, and then the mobile homes are rented. And yes, we definitely are considering those differences in the pre-recovery process. In terms of what types of funding people have access to, as well as what the things that they can use it for.
Thank you very much. And just maybe one other question then that we had from earlier. Is there an avoidable mistake or a lesson related to engaged research that you wish somebody had told you early in your career that you might be able to share with us now?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest thing I've learned is the need to maintain relationships and to give the relationships time to and show them. Like, one of the ways that I did that with the lower Rio Grande Valley is, I'm where I live is about a 6-hour drive away from the lower Rio Grande Valley. But I made it a point. I drove down there once a month. We had monthly meetings, and I would drive down there every month to meet face to face with people, because I knew that it was important to build that relationship and to have that FaceTime. That was all, pre-COVID, pre-Zooming and all of that. And it was difficult. I mean, it took a toll on me. Sometimes I would drive down and drive back the same day, which was not advisable, but In Texas, we drive a lot, and we're used to going long distances, although that's an excessive one. But I think that recognizing the amount of time and effort that went into building the relationships and maintaining the relationships was definitely a lesson learned, but it's something that's paid off over time.
Great. Yeah. I think we've kind of reached the end of our time, so I'd like to offer some sincerest thanks to our guest speaker, Shannon Van Zandt, for joining us today, and also to my colleague Emma Doris for organizing this event. And Emma will send links to any of the resources mentioned during the presentation later on. So many thanks then to everyone for joining us today. And we'll also be putting all our resources and the recorded presentation on the UCD Research portal and on UCD's PPI website. So have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you all again at our next Engage Research seminar in the autumn term. So see you then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.